1768, when Johnson was 59. It appears from his notes on the state of his mind that he suffered great perturbation and distraction in 1768. Nothing of his writing was given to the public this year except the prologue to his friend Goldsmith's comedy of The Good-Natured Man. The first lines of this prologue are strongly characteristical of the dismal gloom of his mind, which in his case, as in the case of all who are distressed with the same malady of imagination, transfers to others its own feelings. Who could suppose it was so to introduce comedy when Mr. Bensley solemnly began, "Pressed with the load of life, the weary mind surveys the general toil of humankind." But this dark ground might make Goldsmith's humor shine the more. In the spring of this year, having published my account of Corsica with the journal of a tour of that island, I returned to London, very desirous to see Dr. Johnson and hear him upon the subject. I found he was at Oxford, with his friend Mr. Chambers, who was now Vinerian professor and Venerable, Vinerian, Vinearian, not venereal or anything, professor, and lived in New Inn Hall. Having had no letter from him since that in which he criticized the Latiny of my thesis, and having been told by somebody that he was offended at my having put into my book an extract of his letter to me at Paris, I was impatient to be with him, and therefore followed him to Oxford, where I was entertained by Mr. Chambers with a civility which I shall ever gratefully remember. I found that Dr. Johnson had sent a letter to me to Scotland, and that I had nothing to complain of but his being more indifferent to my anxiety than I wished him to be. Instead of giving, with the circumstances of time and place, such fragments of his conversation as I preserved during this visit to Oxford, I shall throw them together in continuation. I asked him whether, as a moralist, he did not think that the practice of the law, in some degree, hurt the nice feeling of honesty. Johnson said, "Why, no, sir, if you act properly. You are not to deceive your client with a false representation of your opinion. You are not to tell lies to a judge." I said, "But what do you think of supporting a case which you know to be bad?" Johnson said, "Sir, you do not know it to be good or bad till the judge determines it. I have said that you are to state facts fairly, so that your thinking, or what you call knowing, a cause to be bad, may be from reasoning, must be from your supposing your arguments to be weak and inconclusive. But, sir, that is not enough. An argument which does not convince yourself may convince the judge to whom you urge it. And if it does convince him, why then, sir, you are wrong, and he is right. It is his business to judge, and you are not to be confident in your own opinion that a cause is bad, but to say all you can for your client, and then hear the judge's opinion." Boswell, I said, "But, sir, does not affecting a warmth when you have no warmth, and appearing to be clearly of one opinion when you are in reality of another opinion, does not such a dissimulation impair one's honesty? Is there not some danger that a lawyer may put on the same mask in common life in the intercourse with his friends?" Johnson answered, "Why, no, sir, not everybody knows you are paid for affecting warmth for your client, and it is, therefore, properly no dissimulation. The moment you come from the bar, you resume your usual behavior. Sir, a man will no more carry the artifice of the bar into the common intercourse of society than a man who is paid for tumbling upon his hands will continue to tumble upon his hands when he should walk on his feet." Talking of some of the modern plays, he said False Delicacy was totally void of character. I'm going to do that one of these days. Reference something as being totally void of character. He praised Goldsmith's Good-Natured Man, said it was the best comedy that had appeared since The Provoked Husband, and that there had not been of late any such character exhibited in the stage as that of Croker. I observed it was the suspicious of his Rambler. He said, Goldsmith had owed he had borrowed it from thence. Oh, okay, so Boswell's kissing ass again, saying that Goldsmith ripped off Johnson from something he wrote in the Rambler. Sir, continued Johnson, there is all the difference in the world between characters of nature and characters of manners. And there is the difference between the characters of Fielding and those of Richardson. Characters of manners are very entertaining, but they are to be understood by a more superficial observer than characters of nature, where a man must dive into the recesses of the human heart. It always appeared to me that Johnson estimated the compositions of Richardson too highly, and that he had an unreasonable prejudice against Fielding. Well, I agree with that. In comparing these two writers, he used the expression that there was as great a difference between them as between a man who knows how a watch was made and a man who could tell the hour by looking on the dial plate. This was a short and figurative state of his distinction between drawing characters of nature and characters only of manners. But I cannot help being of opinion that the neat watches of Fielding are as well constructed as the large clocks of Richardson, and that his dial plates are brighter. Fielding's characters, though they do not expand themselves so widely in dissertation, are as just pictures of human nature as I will venture to say have more striking features and nicer touches of the pencil. And though Johnson used to quote with approbation a saying of Richardson's that the virtue of Fielding's heroes were the vices of a truly good man, I will venture to add that the moral tendency of Fielding's writings, though it does not encourage a strained and rarely possible virtue, is ever favorable to honor and honesty, and cherishes the benevolent and generous affections. He who is as good as Fielding would make him is an amiable member of society, and may be led on by more regulated instructors to a higher state of ethical perfection. Okay. Johnson proceeded. Even Sir Francis Wronghead is a character of manners, though drawn with great humor. He then repeated very happily all Sir Francis's credulous accounts to Manly of his being, I guess Manly is a character, with the great man and securing a place. These are, I guess, attributes of the plot, what's this one called? Good-Natured Man, I guess, which I don't know about. I asked him if the suspicious husband did not furnish a well-drawn character, that of Ranger. Johnson said, No, sir, Ranger is just a mere rake, and a lively young fellow, but no character. The great Douglas cause was at this time a very general subject of discussion. I found he had not studied it with much attention, but had only heard parts of it occasionally. He, however, talked of it and said, I am of opinion that positive proof of fraud should not be required of the plaintiff, but that the judge should decide according as the probability shall appear to preponderate, granting to the defendant the presumption of filiation to be strong in his favor. And I think, too, that a good deal of weight should be allowed to the dying declarations because they were spontaneous. There is a great difference between what is said without or being urged to fit and what is said from a kind of compulsion. Let me say that again. There's a great difference between what is said without our being urged to it. I read that totally wrong. And what is said from a kind of compulsion. If I praise a man's book without being asked my opinion of it, that is honest praise to which one may trust. But if an author asked me if I liked his book, and I gave him something like praise, it must not be taken as any real opinion. I have not been troubled for a long time with authors desiring my opinion of their works. I used once to be sadly plagued with a man who wrote verses, but who literally had no other notion of a verse, but that it consisted of 10 syllables. Lay your knife and your fork across your plate was to him a verse. Lay your knife and your fork across your plate. As he wrote a great number of verses, he sometimes by chance made good ones, though he did not know it. Johnson renewed his promise of coming to Scotland and going with me to the Hebrides, but said he would now content himself with seeing one or two of the most curious of them. He said, Macaulay, who writes the account of St. Kilda, set out with a prejudice against prejudices and wanted to be a smart modern thinker, and yet he affirms for a truth that when a ship arrives there, all the inhabitants are seized with the cold. Dr. John Campbell, and I'm remembering now that the Dr. Joseph Campbell is the writer of Man of a Thousand Faces, so this is John Campbell. Obviously, Thousand Faces came many years later, 100, 200 years later. But I think before I said that they had the same name, and they don't. It's John and Joseph. And this is John, Dr. John Campbell. The celebrated writer took a great deal of pains to ascertain this fact about the Hebrides, and attempted to account for it on physical principles, from the effect of effluvia from human bodies. Johnson at other times praised Macaulay for his magnanimity, magnanimousness, only magnanimity, in asserting this wonderful story because it was well attested. A lady of Norfolk, by a letter to a friend, Dr. Burney, has favored me with the following solution. Now for the explanation of this seeming mystery, which is so very obvious as, for that reason, to have escaped the penetration of Dr. Johnson and his friend, as well as that of the author. Reading the book with my ingenious friend, the late Reverend Mr. Christian, of Docking, after ruminating a little, he said, The cause, says he, is a natural one. The situation of St. Kilda renders a northeast wind indispensably necessary before a stranger can land. The wind, not the stranger, causes an epidemic cold. If I am not mistaken, Mr. Macaulay is dead. If living, this solution might please him, as I hope it will Mr. Boswell. This is the author of this note. In return for the many agreeable hours his works have afforded us. Anyway, that part was a little confusing. Johnson expatiated on the advantages of Oxford for learning. There is here, sir, said Johnson, such a progressive emulation. The students are anxious to appear well to their tutors. The tutors are anxious to have their pupils appear well in the college. The colleges are anxious to have their students appear well in the university. And there are excellent rules of discipline in every college. That the rules are sometimes ill-observed may be true, but is nothing against the system. The members of the university may, for a season, be unmindful of their duty. I am urging for the excellency of the institution. Of Guthrie, he said, Sir, he is a man of parts. He has no great regular fund of knowledge, but by reading so long and writing so long, he no doubt has picked up a good deal. You could say that about me. He said he had lately been a long time while in Lichfield, but had grown very weary before he left it. Boswell, I said, I wonder at that, sir. It is your native place. Johnson answered, Why, so is Scotland your native place. His prejudice against Scotland appeared remarkably strong at this time. When I talked of our advancement in literature, Sir, said Johnson, you have learned a little from us, and you think yourselves a very great man. You think yourselves very great men, meaning the Scots. Hume would never have written history had not Voltaire written it before him. He is an echo of Voltaire. I said. But, sir, we have Lord Crames. Johnson said, You have Lord Crames. Keep him. Ha 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 ha. We don't envy you him. Do you even see Dr. Robertson? Boswell said, Yes, sir. Johnson said, Does the dog talk of me? I said, Indeed, sir, he does and loves you. Thinking that I now had him in a corner, and being solicitous for the literary fame of my country, I pressed him with his opinion on the merit of Dr. Robertson's History of Scotland. But to my surprise, he escaped. Johnson said, Sir, I love Robertson, and I won't talk of his book. It is but justice both to him and Dr. Robertson to add that though he indulged himself in the sally of wit, he had too good taste not to be fully sensible of the merits of that admirable work. An essay written by Mr. Dean, a divine of the Church of England, maintaining the future life of brutes by an explication of certain parts of the Scriptures, was mentioned, and the doctrine insisted on by a gentleman. Later footnote tells us this gentleman is Boswell, he's talking about himself, who seemed fond of curious speculation. Johnson, who did not like to hear of anything concerning a future state which was not authorized by the regular canons of orthodoxy, discouraged this talk, and being offended at its continuation, he watched an opportunity to give the gentleman a blow of reprehension. So, when the poor speculist, with a serious metaphysical pensive face, addressed him, But really, sir, when we see a very sensible dog, we don't know what to think of him. That's what Johnson said to him. Johnson, rolling with joy at the thought, which beamed in his eye, turned quickly round and replied, Oh, wait. I fucked that up. It's not my fault, though, because the way it's written. Let me just read this real quick. Okay, so I'm going to start this part over again. Should I read the whole last paragraph again? Yeah, why not? Okay. So, an essay written by Mr. Dean, a divine of the Church of England, maintaining the future life of brutes by an explication of certain parts of the Scriptures, was mentioned, and the doctrine insisted on by a gentleman, meaning Boswell, who seemed fond of curious speculation. Johnson, who did not like to hear of anything concerning a future state which was not authorized by the regular canons of orthodoxy, discouraged this talk, and being offended at its continuation, he watched an opportunity to give the gentleman, meaning Boswell, a blow of reprehension. So when the poor speculatist, with a serious metaphysical pensive face, addressed Johnson, But really, sir, when we see a very sensible dog, we don't know what to think of him. Johnson said, rolling with joy at the thought which beamed in his eye, turned quickly round and replied, True, sir, and when we see a very foolish fellow, we don't know what to think of him either. Or so, close enough. He then rose up, strided to the fire, and stood for some time laughing and exulting. Okay, so they were talking about, I'm guessing, what do you call it, missionary work. And, or that, something of that kind, I'm guessing, is what's going on here. And for some reason, Boswell's being a little passive-aggressive about who's having this argument with Johnson. When the only person he's mentioned being there is himself, so it's him. Anyway, I'm going to move on. I told him, Johnson, that I had several times, when in Italy, seen the experiment of placing a scorpion within a circle of burning coals, that it ran round and round in extreme pain, and finding no way to escape retired to the center, and like a true Stoic philosopher, darted its sting into its end, and thus at once freed itself from its woes. This must end him, I said. This was a curious fact, as it showed deliberate suicide in a reptile. Johnson would not admit this fact. He said, Maupertuis was an opinion that it does not kill itself, but dies of the heat, that it gets to the center of the circle, as the coolest place, that it's turning its tail upon its head is merely a convulsion, and that it does not sting itself. He said he would be satisfied if the great anatomist Morgani, after dissecting a scorpion on which the experiment had been tried, should certify that its sting had penetrated into its head. Footnote here about Maupertuis. I should think it impossible not to wonder at the variety of Johnson's reading, however dissolutely it may have been. Who could have imagined that the High Church of England man would be so prompt in quoting Maupertuis, who, I am sorry to think, stands in the list of those unfortunate mistaken men who call themselves Espiritus Fortis. I have, however, a high respect for that philosopher whom the great Frederick of Prussia loved and honored, and addressed pathetically in one of his poems, Maupertuis, cher Maupertuis, que notre vie est peu douceuse. There was in Maupertuis a vigor and yet a tenderness of sentiment, united with strong intellectual powers, an uncommon ardor of soul. Would he have been a Christian? I cannot help earnestly venturing to hope that he is one now. All right, well, a little uneven reading that time, but I still got way over 1,000 pages to go, so there will be good days and bad days. Till next time, bye from Boswell.